Welcome, Hampton Roads, to the first Beach Brothers show of the new year. You care about Virginia? You care about business? You care about politics? Then you're right, the right place.
So look, the Beach Brothers Show is a show where we deal with Virginia business and politics.
Well, I'm Conrad Chesviner. I'm a Hampton Roads political activist. Best ideas for community improvement happen to drive me.
I help folks that are approaching retirement and in their retirement years.
I have what I call the empowerment agenda, and that means that everything I do is focused on empowerment. You want to give a salute to Tally and Twine. It's time for you to have a high quality watch made in Virginia, made in Portsmouth, Virginia, from Tally and Twine. We want to say thanks to Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier for their great level of sponsorship. If you need a new car, you don't need to go far. Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier. And ladies, if you want your brows to say, wow, check out IamLitaWee.com. Microblading by IamLitaWee.com. I'm Seiko Varner. I do credit fixes, tax resolutions. I lend private money to real estate investors, and we do debt consolidations. If you need any of these services, contact me as provided. And now it's time to get beachy on the Beach Brothers Show.
Virginia, look out this weekend. We're going to get hard by another snowstorm. Well, not here in Hampton Roads, but the rest of the state. Yeah, you're going to get hit. And you need a safe, solid car to get around during these events. So you got to get yourself a car over at Southern Volkswagen in Chesapeake. It's a safe, solid car to get around in these big weather events. Head on down to see Charlie Roy over on 1248 South Military Highway. Charlie Roy will help you get one of those safe, solid cars to maneuver around either in sleet or rain or snow or any big Virginia weather event. Now, on a political front, I noticed former delegate and former Virginia governor candidate Jennifer Carroll Foy has announced she is running for Virginia's 33rd State Senate District. I'm intrigued by this. After all, I am a member of the Hampton Roads Battle Cats. Let me get that picture up there, the community action team, compelling our agenda economically, politically, and socially. I'm also a co-founding member of the Virginia Beach Progressive Caucus. Throw that up there too, because we are going to make sure that we push for all the best things for our electeds to do in the future from out of the above Virginia Beach. I'm also a member of the Virginia Beach Democratic Committee. So seeing Delegate Carroll Foy announce that she's going to run for state senate is something that I'm happy about. But she's now moving to a state senate race, and they're up in 2023, and their district designs are all new. I wanted to unpack that newness because Virginia has reshaped its representation in the federal races, in the state senate races, and in the House of Delegate races. As an example, I live in Virginia Beach, and our Congress rep now has to serve into Chesapeake and Suffolk and points westward, but no longer on the peninsula or Norfolk. My House of Delegates rep, Kelly Fowler, is no longer going to be my rep as her 21st district is moved out, and my district will be the new and improved 96th district. My state Senate seat is screwy too. All of these changes are intriguing, not only in my own ambition to run for office again, but just to see what it all means for Virginians all over. That's why our guest tonight is Sam Shirazi. I'm going to bring him on right now. Sam has lived in Virginia since 2006. When he moved here to attend UVA for college. He also attended UVA for law school, and he is barred here in Virginia. During the last 15 years, Sam has been involved in various political campaigns in the federal, state, and local level. In 2021, Sam was actively involved in public comment at the Virginia Redistricting Commission and the Virginia Supreme Court. So naturally, he's going to be perfect for this topic tonight. He currently lives in Arlington, and you can check out his Twitter feed for Virginia political coverage at Sam Shirazi M. I'm going to throw that up there because that's the most recent one right before the show. I like hyping that up too. So, Mr. Shirazi, thank you so much for joining us. First, we want to know, how are you now, and how was your week?
Good, good. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. I think, like a lot of us, trying to hang in there with COVID and other things. And I have 2 kids that keep me busy, so you might hear them during the show. But yeah, I'm doing well and getting ready for the snowstorm. So just kind of normal Virginia stuff.
Yeah, I will admit you're probably going to get that snowstorm in Arlington harder than we would get that here in Virginia Beach. But hey, what can you do? I might be a snow fan, but I can't control the weather. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you came to Virginia to study at UVA. You became a lawyer from UVA. So tell us some more of your journey into politics, if you will.
Sure. So I actually grew up in Los Angeles, and I wanted to get away. I wanted to try something totally different. So I decided to come to Virginia in 2006. I actually didn't even visit UVA before I decided to go there. But it was a great experience. I love Charlottesville. I think it's a great place. And, I'd always been interested in politics, and I came to Virginia pretty much at the perfect time because 2006 was right when Virginia moved from a red state to kind of a swing state. It's kind of gone a little bit more blue. Now it's back to the swing state. So I think I've been able to see the last 15 years. I kind of got involved as much as you could in college, kind of local campaigns. And in 2008, I worked pretty intensely on the Obama campaign in Charlottesville, registering students, getting students to vote. That was a very successful campaign. Since then, it's been a little bit kind of as I've had time, as I've had interest in certain campaigns. I've been kind of starting to get more involved in the Arlington political scene. But, I've also had a career, I've had a family. So it's been a little bit off and on with the politics stuff. And I decided fairly recently to get more involved, at least more in terms of expressing my views, particularly at the Redistricting Commission, and we can talk about that. But, I saw that there was some space to kind of someone like me who I don't necessarily have an agenda. I don't necessarily kind of have any sort of interest other than kind of explaining things, talking about issues, talking about what's going on in Virginia politics. I mean, I obviously have my personal opinions, but no one's paying me. I'm not like doing this on behalf of anyone. I'm just kind of doing out of interest, as I think probably a lot of your listeners are also in that camp. So anyways, that's a little bit about me.
I do like that fact because I have my own biases. I ran for office myself, but when it comes to doing a show like this, I just want people to learn things as much. And that's why I friended you over on Facebook a while back, and I've been following your input on various things on Facebook mainly. And I'm like, he knows his stuff. So this particular topic, when it comes to redistricting, I came to you because I knew you'd be probably one of the best ones for that. And on that front, before we talk about what's new with redistricting per se, can you give us your take on what sort of Virginia's districts were and how they effectively or ineffectively represented our communities prior to 2020?
Sure. So, for the most part, all the maps at the federal and the state level were essentially various forms of gerrymanders that were put in last decade. There were some court cases in the federal congressional maps and the House of Delegates that helped unpack some of those gerrymanders. But for the most part, some of those weird lines, particularly if you look in places like Northern Virginia, are there because that's the way they were drawn. I think the Republicans drew the map a certain way, especially in the House of Delegates. And even at the federal level, if you look at the 7th district that's now held by Congresswoman Spanberger, I don't think they anticipated a lot of those seats would become Democratic. But because Virginia, especially during the Trump era, moved a lot more in the Democratic column, there were a lot of seats that flipped, particularly in 2017, 2019, 2018, that kind of undid that gerrymandering. So it doesn't look as gerrymandered as it is because the state moved. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the previous maps were various versions of gerrymanders. There's some odd districts. They don't always do a good job, and so that was kind of the starting point, and it helps explain why we ended up having this amendment and some other things. But anyways, that's kind of where we were with the old maps. They were gerrymandered, but because Virginia started moving so Democratic, it seems less gerrymandered than it is.
All right, all right. And also the population itself grew, so they all settled in certain areas. So every 10 years when we do the census, we just have to make sure that we get an accurate count of where people are and how much they are of them. But, in 2020 was also that constitutional amendment. If you could you break it down and the two sides of it and what the outcome was?
Sure. So I, to be honest, was not following it super closely back then, although I've gone back and kind of researched what happened. I think a lot of people weren't paying too much attention because it was 2020 when it was on the ballot, and obviously there was the presidential election. But essentially, when there'd been a group of people, good government type people, who had been advocating for redistricting reform for several years. I mean, really going back to the middle of the decade. And then obviously there was the ticking clock of, we're going to have to do redistricting in 2021. How do we do it? Do we do it the old-fashioned way where the legislature draws it and it's mainly drawn for political reasons, or do we try something else? And I think there was this odd time in Virginia history because you need to pass an amendment in two subsequent House or General Assembly sessions. So it passed in 2019, I believe, and 2020. And that's how it got on the ballot. And if you think about that time period, it was when the Republicans were really kind of at the end of the Trump era and not doing well in Virginia. So they had an incentive to support this because in their minds, the Democrats are going to take over and they're going to gerrymander the maps against us. So we might as well get something that's a little bit more neutral. So the Republicans were fairly unified in supporting it. I think the Democrats had a lot of internal conflicts. In the House, particularly the Black Caucus was concerned about minority representation. There were other people who just thought, this is our chance to draw the lines. Why would we give it away? Maybe redistricting reform is a good idea, but they're not going to do that in Texas or in Georgia. So why would we do it in Virginia? But there was a group of Democrats who kind of, I call them good government type people. They said, this is the right thing to do. We can't always worry about the political consequences. We have to do what we think is right. And so it ended up passing, and it got on the ballot. And honestly, once it got on the ballot, it was going to pass. I think it passed like 2-1 because who's going to vote down redistricting reform? I mean, it sounds good. There were a lot of flaws with the amendment that we can talk about, but once it got on the ballot, it was basically a done deal.
Now, I, over the years in my studying of the Virginia General Assembly, I've been a fan of Delegate Aird, and she was a member of that caucus, and she was very vocal against it passed anyway. And then she's no longer in because of the recent elections. That's unrelated. It's just very interesting to see that you are correct. There was this dichotomy even within the Democrat Party to the supports in either way. And we just ended up getting whatever we got. And in the sense that 2021 was the year that the effect of that amendment came through, it created a commission to sort of tackle this. In 2021, of course, was one of those unbelievable political years. It was a year the commission started, but to your knowledge, did it actually do much of anything?
Yeah, so that's when I really got involved because I thought, we have this new process. It's supposed to be kind of reform and the public should get involved. So I started really following it and listening to the hearings and trying to give my input. But honestly, I think everyone would agree, Republicans, Democrats, people on the commission, the structure of it made it basically impossible for it to work. And just to kind of explain the structure, I believe there were 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans. And on each side, there were 4 politicians, so members of the General Assembly, and then there were 4 citizens. And to pass anything, you needed to pass the final maps, you needed a supermajority. So basically, everyone would have to agree on these maps, and you have politicians on the committee, on the commission, and it basically deadlocked. All the important votes were 8-8 ties. My personal experience was each side hired their consultants, each side hired their own lawyers, and it kind of devolved into, how do we game the system? How do we advance our agenda? I mean, I'm just going to be honest about kind of what I'm going to call it as I see it. I don't want to do this both sides-ism thing. I think it was worse on the Republican side. I don't doubt that there was some of it on the Democratic side, but the Republican side really was just, let's, get the maximum we can get out of this commission. And I can tell you that my claim to fame in a moment, if you'd like, with the Tom Davis map. But essentially, that was not the way this commission was set up. You can't maximize your own game. You have to compromise. Mm-hmm. And there was no compromise, and it just fell apart. And so basically nothing happened.
Well, I don't exactly want to stop you from being able to provide opinion if you think it is also helpful to do that. For instance, I'll provide my own right now. Going in, I heard a lot of very anti folks for it who definitely wanted to do it the right way, but they didn't think that that particular commission was that version of the right way because of basically how you just described it. They foresaw it, tried to warn the entire voting populace. It was a complete statewide amendment, and it won pretty popularly. But what would you say would a lesson that we should take from that? Is that could it have worked, or is by design with politics, both Democrat side, which they were mixed, and Republican side, they were mixed. They each have sides. Our side, their side, everyone's side has things that they selfishly want to do. So by nature, it's almost like this was designed to fall apart. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are different states that have certainly better commissions. I think California, Michigan, although they may have their own flaws. There were several lessons that I learned. One is you can't have an even commission of even number. You need an odd number. You need a tiebreaker, because they were taking votes and it was always 8-8. And so nothing could get done. I don't think the politicians did a good job I don't want to say that. I think it didn't make sense to have politicians on the commission, because the citizens would always look to the politicians, at least some of them, for their cues. And I think the structure where there was no voice for non-Democrats or Republicans, you could imagine a different structure where it was 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents, and then, a simple majority could pass something. And so both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, would maybe try to convince the 5 independents that they're doing the fairest maps. That happens in some other states. Now, I've heard that, in California, the Democrats figured out how to game the California Commission. You're always going to have politics involved, but I think the way it's currently structured is just crazy. I think if this happens again in 2031, they're not going to pass maps again in 2031. So there's talks about a new amendment to maybe update the commission structure, but I think, we'll see. We'll see if that actually can get done.
They're already talking about it, and it's only about a year or so after it was created in the first place. It's sort of I'm a big fan of sports, so I'm going to make a brief sports comparison here. The fact that we got rid of the BCS with the top 4 selections for National College Football, and then immediately we're like, okay, the top 4 is not good enough. We got to keep expanding it. So this is just like that when it comes to politics. We could have seen it coming if we wanted to look a little further down the line, but I guess we got a little short-sighted in terms of both the people and the politicians who represent the people. And I sort of want to leave it to the fact that, yeah, we could admit that it sort of fell apart at its intended goal, and it ended up still going somewhere because we have new maps. So if you could also break down the process of how that falls apart and then it goes to the Virginia courts.
Sure. So at the commission, there were two stages. There was the state drafting stage for the General Assembly maps, and then the federal stage. So at the state level, at the state the time period of the state maps, it just they couldn't agree on anything, and there was this kind of contentious meeting where some of the Democratic members walked out, and it was just kind of a complete implosion. At the federal maps for the congressional level, they said, all right, we'll try again. We'll give it another shot. Unfortunately, they basically did the exact same thing they did last time. And what that was the Democrats would make some maps and the Republicans would make some maps. They tried to be a little bit more bipartisan by giving certain people districts, certain parties districts to draw. There was some shenanigans behind the scenes where a former Republican Congressman, Tom Davis, submitted a map, and then the Republicans used that map, or at least a good portion of that map, without disclosing it. And then, I was the one who figured it out. I put it out there, and then I actually think that helped because there was some honesty, and they were slowly making a little bit of progress. They were listening to public comment, but at the end of the day, the politics was just too much. They couldn't come to an agreement. So nothing happened. And if the commission failed to draw maps, the amendment said, okay, this gets punted to the Virginia Supreme Court. And that's what ended up happening.
All right. How long of a process was the court deliberation on this?
Well, the court was very quick. I think it got punted over, I want to say right after the election. So the court got this beginning of November, and the final maps were out right after Christmas. So, to the court's credit, I think they were quick. They got the job done, and that's what courts do. Typically, they're like, you want me to decide? I'm going to decide whether it's perfect, or we can talk about that. But they got it done, and so I think that's a lot of the advocates for the amendment said, look, we know the commission has problems, but we're really excited about the court because, we trust the court. I think the court didn't play politics. I think they genuinely were trying to draw fair maps. They hired these two special masters. So we can talk about the pros and cons of that process. I was a little bit disappointed because I think there was less public participation than possible at the court, and that's just the nature of how courts operate. And also, I don't think it's this great victory that like the commission collapsed and then the court drew the maps. I mean, I think it happened, but I wouldn't celebrate that as like the great success of Virginia Redistricting.
Could you talk about the special masters? It's terminology that even if you're not following the state version and you only followed locally here in Virginia Beach, that's something we had to deal with too, because we went from our at-large system over to direct district representation.
Yeah.
Because the city couldn't figure it out, that they turned it over to the courts, and we had another special master situation. But again, that's not a relation to the constitutional amendment. That's just our citywide. So special masters as a term that effectively means what?
So special master is something that is actually a legal term. So courts are good at legal stuff. They know the law. But whenever there's really technical expertise stuff, they will bring in a special master. It's kind of a fancy term, but it's essentially a consultant or an expert. And obviously the justices on the Supreme Court aren't redistricting experts. And so the amendment actually specifies that they have to have special masters. So these are essentially just experts in redistricting, and the amendment says there has to be one Democrat, one Republican that was nominated by the leaders in the General Assembly. There was a little bit of controversy because the ones the Republicans initially nominated were very had some conflicts of interest. The court saw that. They nominated a few other people, and eventually they got the two special masters, one from the Democrat side, one from the Republican side.
It sort of sounds like they tried to be as impartial with it as we thought the commission itself would be, but it's a lot less people. And then we ended up getting the maps that we had. So all the House districts and all the Senate districts, even the federal districts, in some way have been modified. So can you break down, Billy, significant changes for all three?
Sure. So I don't know if you have a preference of where to start. Do you want to start at the state level or the federal level?
Let's go from top down. Let's go straight from federal.
Sure. So federal, there were a couple big changes, but then some of the things didn't really change. So I'll talk about the things that didn't change. Some of the districts are always going to be about the same, and they're always going to have the same party. So I live in Arlington. That's the 8th district. You're always going to have an inner Nova seat that's safe Democratic. Southwest Virginia is basically always going to look the same, and it's always going to be safe Republican, or at least, for this decade. So I would say, 8 of the, basically 9 of the 11 didn't change a whole lot. There were some minor changes here and there. I think the 2 big changes were the 2 swing districts, because currently in Virginia, there are 2 swing districts that are kind of pure toss-ups. I mean, we have some that are a little bit competitive, but there are 2 that are pure toss-ups. That is the 7th district, currently represented by Abigail Spanberger, and the 2nd district down where you are, represented by Elaine Luria. And I can talk about both of those. So the Spanberger district, the 7th district, it went from a district that was the Richmond suburbs, and it got rid of most of the Richmond suburbs and transferred a lot of that to Nova. And I think the idea was there'd been so much population growth in Nova that special masters thought that we need to have another Nova seat. And that caused a lot of controversy. The people in Richmond were not super happy about it, because the Richmond suburbs were transferred to the 1st district, represented by Congressman Whitman, and he hadn't really represented that area. But anyway, so the Spanberger seat, it became essentially a lean Democratic seat. It voted for Biden, I believe, by about 8 points. There was some talk about, well, which district is Spanberger going to run in? She's decided to run in the 7th. There'd been some discussions about, will someone run against her in the primary? I think she's pretty much got that seat, that primary locked up, unless someone announces, and they haven't announced. So we're going to have that race, which will be in 2022 very competitive, although I think most people think it leans Democratic at the moment. And then you have the 2nd district down in Hampton Roads. There was a lot of controversy about this district because it takes Norfolk out of the district, and of course, Congresswoman Luria is from Norfolk, and it's instead of being purely based in Hampton Roads and going across the water into the Williamsburg area, it goes west all the way to Suffolk. And I think the big change here is this district became not a lot, but it came slightly redder. So it's still voted for Biden, but just barely. And I think in a 2022 environment, Republicans really think this is a top pickup opportunity. And, we can talk about my critiques of the special masters. One of the critiques I have is they didn't listen to public comment in Hampton Roads. There's a famous line in their memo explaining why they did what they did, but they basically said it was too late in the game to change the 2nd district because people, there was comments that said it should be based more in kind of the core Hampton Roads areas of Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and instead of stretching it out to the west. But they, for whatever reason, I think because they wanted to balance out the 7th being lean Democratic, I think they wanted to make the 2nd a little bit more Republican, and that's why they did what they did.
How much would you say you'd be able to recall of what was, I guess, in that memo of Hampton Roads itself? What were people who, if they could, what would they have said in Richmond into the courts to try to convince their way through?
So I think there were different arguments. I mean, I think the legitimate argument in my mind is that, the Norfolk naval base is so kind of interlinked with the Virginia Beach area, and so it's odd for them to be in separate districts completely, and it's also odd for the Eastern Shore to kind of stretch all the way, past Suffolk, and so that was kind of the more practical comments about it makes more sense to have a real Hampton Roads kind of base seat as opposed to one that's stretching further out. And there were some political comments, just generally that this was hurting Luria, that they were hurting, Democratic chances. I think they were really kind of suspect of that. Congressman Scott, who also represents Hampton Roads, he put in an interesting comment, a letter to the Supreme Court, and basically said, my district still has too many African Americans. Like you're almost packing my district, and it makes sense to put some of them in another district. But like I said, they basically didn't change it at all. They just said, this is the maps we have, and sorry.
And in a sense, his district has sort of been that way for a little while. I went to OU from 2005 to 2012, and one of my classes when I was doing my bachelor's in political science was electoral politics with former Congressman G. William Whitehurst. He had even said at the time, this is before 2012, that district is sort of like seemingly designed for him. And it has been that way before and afterwards since, and still now. So it's interesting to know that he is some ways critiquing that in the sense that he would like to split it up a little bit. If I remember, what was it? Less than 750,000 is what one district is supposed to roughly represent, or something like that in terms of population. And Hampton Roads is bordering now on 2 million people, if I recall, if you split it over among the 7 cities in the peninsula and the Eastern Shore. So we would probably need a weird split, and we got a weird split from the Eastern Shore down through Virginia Beach. And yeah, and it was also interesting in that Elaine doesn't necessarily have to live in Virginia Beach or the Eastern Shore or Chesapeake in order to run for it, because that's the House rules is you can be slightly out of the district and still run. I think Republicans have done that in Virginia too. So what was it? I forgot the name of the Forbes. Forbes was the guy who was sort of moved out of his district, that specific district, and then tried to run in a primary from outside of it and ended up losing. I guess it's just sort of a bad look. But in any case, that was that particular thing. Do you think both Luria and Spanberger are going to effectively be able to move into their respective districts? That they're still going to run for 7 and 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think Luria certainly, I don't think that will be a huge issue because, it's a few miles and, she's represented Virginia Beach this whole time. So I think, while she got dealt a bad hand in the sense that her district got more Republican, I don't think that is necessarily going to be a huge issue for her. There was a lot of talk with Spanberger because there was an initial map and then there was the final revised map. And in the initial map, it was much more, the 7th district was much more Nova centric. And there was a lot of talk, well, like, how can Spanberger run in this district? I think in the final version, they moved it down more towards Richmond. It didn't quite get to Richmond, but it's really kind of the northern part of the Richmond exurbs. So I think in that sense, she got kind of lucky. And so I think from what I've seen, I don't think there's a huge appetite for anyone to really take her on in a primary. I think she may have a couple who step up, but I think it's it seems unlikely that unless something drastic happens, I think she'll have not a huge issue with being kind of moving up to that district.
I think that more or less might be the same in the 2nd district too. There might not necessarily be that big of a primary or anything. I know the Republicans, I think, is going to have a pretty competitive primary themselves. But, this is all what 2022 is going to be just as hectic, I guess, as 2020 was, except, without the looming presidential election overhead. But then again, the redistricting did more than just federal. It also did General Assembly when it came to state Senate and House delegates. Could you break down what happened in the state Senate in those 40 seats?
Sure. And before I get into the state stuff, I should note one thing that I think is probably the biggest critique I have of the special masters, and that is that they tried to do this thing called nesting, and it's a real kind of inside baseball kind of thing with redistricting. But essentially, the idea is, you have three levels. You have the congressional level, which is the biggest. Then you have the state Senate, which is in the middle, and then you have the House of Delegates. And what they tried to do was put all the state Senate. They tried to put the state Senate within the congressional districts, and then the House of Delegates within the state Senate. And it's a very academic thing. In theory, it might be a good idea. I think in practice, it kind of caused a lot of problems, particularly in the House of Delegates, a little bit in the state Senate, but really, it was a weird thing that they did, and Virginia code doesn't require it. I think that was like the biggest criticism people had in terms of just the mechanics of what they did. It was very odd how they drew those some of those districts. So, anyways, but starting off with the state Senate, I think the state Senate had less issues in terms of some of these districts than the House of Delegates with this nesting thing. But overall, I think there was some interesting changes kind of under the hood. So kind of the practical effect was Democrats have a lot of safe seats, but not enough for a majority. And so there's kind of a few toss-up seats that are going to decide who's going to control the state Senate. So I think the Democrats in 2023, when the state Senate is up, can't take it for granted because they're in the majority right now, and the state Senate is the only thing stopping a trifecta where the Republicans can pass whatever they want. So if the Democrats lose the state Senate and then they also lose the House of Delegates again, Youngkin and the Republicans can pass whatever they want. So the state Senate is the Alamo right now, and it's on a knife's edge, and it's going to be on a knife's edge in 2023. And why is that? A couple districts, one in particular where the Democrats currently have a seat. This is in Southwest Virginia, a Roanoke-based seat that is currently held by John Edwards, has become much more Republican. So I think they're just going to lose a seat that way. It's made up for it a little bit that Nova has gotten less gerrymandered, but I think that's going to be a seat that Democrats are going to lose in 2023 unless something happens or there's an upset. And then this isn't going to change the political map, but it's kind of an interesting state Senate seat in the Charlottesville area where Cree Deeds, who ran for governor in 2009, he was drawn out of his home, which is in Bath County. He's announced that he's moving to Charlottesville or relocating to Charlottesville to run, and I could see a primary challenger on the left, so that'll be an interesting race. You mentioned the one in
33.
Yep, in Northern Virginia, primarily based in Prince William County. Jennifer Carroll Foy has announced. There's talks that mispronouncing her name, 2021 Lieutenant Governor nominee, she may want to run in the same district, which would be a very interesting primary. And then I'll mention one more interesting district, which is, he was in the news today. I'm not sure if you saw, but
Morrissey.
Yep, Joe Morrissey got a pardon by outgoing Governor Northam. He's a character, and he has been on people's radars in terms of wanting to maybe get rid of him. But we'll see. He's got a lot of local appeal. So anyways, I mean, these are some things that are kind of going on with some of these seats. I think big picture, at least in 2023, is Democrats can't take it for granted. They have to fight for the state Senate because they currently have a 21-19 majority. It'll be on a knife's edge again in 2023.
Now, as our show tends to be a little bit of a hub from Virginia Beach to Hampton Roads, then to Virginia, how much would you say you'd be able to say Kagan's seat and DeStaff's seat, Cosgrove's seat, could be competitive for the Democrats? Because I know they're all Republicans now.
So to be perfectly honest, I am not as familiar as Hampton Roads as I wish I was, and I have to spend some time. I think in the state Senate, they're probably won't be too many changes. I think from what I saw, the state Senate was fairly stable in the Hampton Roads area. So I don't, while the lines have shifted, I don't think that it's necessarily in the state Senate going to be as big of a battleground. I think in the House of Delegates, it'll be more of a battleground. But I think, and part of the reason why Hampton Roads at the state Senate level was a little bit more stable is just because of kind of the way that there are some districts that have to be African American opportunity districts based on the Voting Rights Act. So there's really only a certain way you can draw it. And so I think at the state Senate level, Hampton Roads is going to be relatively quiet. I think most of the action is going to be either in Nova or in the Richmond area.
All right, all right. Now, how about the big ticket items in the sense of when we think about districting, we think about a lot of districts on a map, and there's 100 of them across the state when it comes to House of Delegates. So break down what were the significant changes. And I say that as if, other than the fact that I'm in 21 right now and I'm going to be in 96. I mean, how do numbers sway like that?
Yeah. So House of Delegates, there's a lot going on. And I think this was the place where there was the biggest issues. And it's easy to kind of not really know what's happening because there's so many of them and, they all kind of look okay. I think they basically renumbered everything. So I don't think the numbers themselves are super significant. I think they just kind of threw different numbers around. But, they're the smallest. And so you could see very big changes depending on where you live. And again, the nesting really kind of screwed things up in certain areas, in my opinion. And so there's a few things going on in the House of Delegates. One is, and I don't want to pretend to be a kind of election law expert and a voting rights law expert. I am a lawyer, but I'm not. That's not what I practice. So I don't want to over analyze things. But I think one area of disappointment is that there are probably going to be less what's called opportunity districts under the Voting Rights Act than currently. And the special masters kind of explained that, it is what it is. Like there's kind of demographic changes in terms of South Side losing some population. And so they, I think South Side, is going to be less of a battleground, particularly Roz Tyler, who lost her seat in 2021. I mean, that seat is basically not going to be competitive anymore just because of how they drew it. So not to get too much into inside baseball, but my critique was that they kind of drew things in a way that didn't necessarily give maximum opportunity to African Americans. And I think they have their justifications. They say, like, we can't overly emphasize race, and there's Supreme Court decisions that basically say that. So they were trying to kind of be safe, in my opinion. And so that's kind of a critique at the kind of micro level that some of these districts, particularly in the South Side, might not end up electing African American preferred candidates. And I think so that's kind of one issue that I think the other maps didn't have because those were bigger districts and various other reasons. I also think this is going to be another area where it's going to be competitive. And it's very similar to state Senate, where the Democrats have a lot of safe seats. So I think they're at almost 49 safe seats, and you need 51 for a majority. So you're like, well, that's great, but those last two seats are going to be really tough for the Democrats, particularly in an environment like 2023. So again, the Democrats can't take it for granted. I think, there had been this expectation, well, population change and Nova has grown, and so we're going to have the House of Delegates for the rest of the decade. I think for various reasons, the way they drew things, that's not going to be the case. And I can talk about some specific districts if you'd like, or I don't know if you have
let's break down the fact that we just had a special election a couple days ago in Norfolk in '89. Jackie Jackson Glass won that pretty handily. Pretty good candidates, but again, the next day she gets to go to Richmond and get sworn in, so she's immediately starting. The next year she has to run again, but Is it even going to be 89? Is it going to be something completely different, or?
I think that district is roughly the same, although I'd have to check on that. I think, all that was, I think from the political class, or at least the House of Delegates, a lot of them were upset. So there's this big issue about the special masters didn't care where people lived. And so there's a lot of delegates drawn into the same districts. There's a lot of questions about and kind of backroom deals. I'll move to this district, or we're going to fight it out in a primary. I mean, all that has to get worked out. I'm not entirely sure it's kind of a mystery to me, because I think they're working it out behind the scenes. Some of those districts have not been resolved yet in terms of who's running in which district. So I think that's a significant change. And I think, again, I don't want to overemphasize the nesting thing, but I think that a lot of the House of Delegates members who were frustrated pointed to nesting and said, this doesn't make any sense. And I'll give you a couple examples of where nesting made things weird. And this is getting kind of really into the weeds, but one of them was in Loudoun County. So I don't know if you followed the race that involved Wendy Goditis, which was kind of a toss-up race. And she won in 2021. A lot of people didn't think she'd win. She was the Democrat in Western Loudoun County and Clark County. But that district has been totally reshaped, where her home in Clark County has been moved to a safe Republican seat. And then the kind of toss-up Western Loudoun seat has moved south into Fauquier. And I was like, why would they do this? This doesn't make sense. If you live there, you know that it makes sense to connect Western Loudoun and Clark. It doesn't make sense to connect Western Loudoun and Fauquier. But they did it because of nesting. And so this kind of big decision that affects Wendy Goditis, and it's still unclear what she's going to do, it was just because they had this academic theory about how to draw the maps, not the best way to draw the maps. So that was kind of an example. And there's a lot of those examples all over the place. One thing I heard a lot of criticism about, similar to Hampton Roads, they didn't listen. At the congressional level with Hampton Roads, they didn't listen to public comment. Another area they didn't listen to public comment, which was in Southwest Virginia in the Roanoke and New River Valley. So this is kind of Blacksburg, Radford area. Radford and Blacksburg are 10 miles apart. They're both college towns. They're in different House of Delegates districts. And a lot of, I'm not from there. I'm not super familiar with the area, but a lot of people were like, this doesn't make any sense. These districts are you're splitting up a lot of communities. And I think they ultimately just said it would have a huge political consequence, which I don't even know what that means, but there was basically a toss-up seat there right now. And it's become more Republican. And I wonder if it's just, I don't know. They thought the short of it is there'll be only one Democratic seat in all of Southwest Virginia in the House of Delegates, which will be in Roanoke. Whereas before there possibly were two, even though the Democrats lost it in 2021. But anyway, so I think kind of summarizing all the different maps, I think they certainly weren't the worst maps possible, but they had a lot of issues. And I think a lot of people kind of didn't want to spend time looking at it, kind of said, well, the maps are what they are. I had a temptation not to do that. I didn't want to just say, well, they're done, let's just live with them. I wanted to critique and say, this was good, this was bad. I wouldn't say that they did a unbelievably great job. I don't think it was, I think there could have been better maps, but they're not the maps we got. And so kind of stuck with them. And, it is what it is.
For the sake of, the organization, community action teams, and the battle cats, where we're trying to, empower all of our various communities, would you say that these districting maps, and this is where we can sort of balance objective truth and maybe our own opinions, and how you admit we don't have as many of the opportunity districts as we did because the courts didn't want to make it so overt. Does this mean that in effect could have hurt our various communities throughout the state?
Yeah, so I think the issue of race is very interesting, because if you look at the commission, there was a lot of time spent arguing about how should we consider race, and that was part of the reason the commission broke down. And at the Supreme Court, they were very careful to kind of walk a fine line. And there's different schools of thought. One of them is that, we're in this new Virginia. We passed the Voting Rights Act in Virginia. We're supposed to kind of be the new South. We've moved past the old Confederacy. But these maps don't really show a huge commitment to minority representation. I think it was, how do we comply with the Voting Rights Act? It wasn't like, let's try to make sure we get as many kind of minority candidates and minority opportunities as possible. And so I think that was one critique. The other side might say, look, these kind of old school opportunity districts in Richmond and Southside and Hampton Roads, you're missing out on, all the diversity in Northern Virginia. There's a lot of, you don't necessarily have to be the same race as the race of the majority of people living in a district to get elected. We're kind of in a different time in terms of kind of racial politics. I think, my personal opinion is, I think that's a little bit naive. I think there are parts of Virginia, maybe not Northern Virginia, but other parts of Virginia where, it's just the reality that most white people vote Republican, most Black people vote Democrat. And the Voting Rights Act is created in a specific way to ensure that where African Americans are maybe 40% of the population, they don't never get to elect anyone. But if you look at one of the maps that is Southside, one of the House of Delegates districts, African Americans, I think, are 42% of the population, but that district voted for Trump. So those 42% are never really going to elect a candidate that they prefer, which is typically a Democratic candidate. And special masters just kind of said, well, we can't create crazy districts to make sure that we maximize African American representation, because that would also violate the Constitution. And I'm sympathetic to that, but at the same time, you have to balance these two conflicting interests. And I think there could have been a better job balancing them, and there could have been better maps drawn in certain areas. So anyways, that's a long way of saying that I think race is very complicated. It's complicated redistricting. I don't think there was a blatant attempt to disenfranchise people, but I think there could have been a better job.
In the sense of that, do we have any recourse if we wanted to provide public opinion to our electeds on this particular matter going forward, or would you say it is now what it is?
So, I think that was one of the critiques I had of this kind of punting it to the Supreme Court. There was basically a 3-week opportunity or 1-month time frame to provide public comment. People did. Some of it was taken into account. Some of it was ignored. But that's the way redistricting works. Once the maps are final, they're final. I mean, you can, I've talked to people who were frustrated with the maps, but their attitude is well, we got to focus on the election now and do the best we can with the maps. I'm not an expert in election law. In theory, there could be lawsuits. I've heard certain people say, well, this could get into litigation with some of the Voting Rights Act issues. I'm not an expert in that area. I don't know if that's going to happen. That's really the only way it could change, is that if there's a lawsuit filed in federal court, because again, the state court already approved it. I mean, this is the Supreme Court, so you're not going to sue in Virginia state court. If anyone wants to, they could sue in federal court under the Voting Rights Act. Who knows? I think that's unlikely, but it could happen. And that's really the only way to change the maps at this point. I mean, they're final.
I guess it is effectively what it is. And that means that I guess that we sort of reached the end on that particular version of the topic. And Mr. Sam, I'm glad we've been able to have you on tonight. And on this note, may we have final words, comments that you might be able to provide your own followers, our viewers, and how do we keep up with you on social media, etc.?
Sure. So I will be trying to tweet about these new maps and how they're going to affect the election. I mainly do that on Twitter. So that's going to be my social media that you mentioned. That's at Sam Shirazi M. I think I guess my only point is you'll hear people either say, this was great, this was a great success, and Virginia is the greatest redistricting success in the country, or these are the worst maps ever produced. And politics, there isn't a lot of nuance, but I'm trying to encourage people to kind of think critically and try to be a little bit nuanced about this. Like, it was not horrible, it wasn't great, like it was kind of in the middle, and it's hard for people to admit that, but that's kind of the reality. And so I guess it's good generally in politics to try to be a little bit more nuanced, a little less kind of absolute, and that's what I've learned through the redistricting process, and hopefully people can take it in other parts of politics as well.
I would join you in wishing that I hope that our populace becomes more nuanced in being able to think about things like this. And I think it'll then translate into having better elected representatives. But perhaps that's one thing down the line. In any case, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Shirazi, for coming on. And I just hope you have a great Friday and stay safe, of course, on Sunday when the storm rolls through. Hope you have a great night.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, Beach Brothers Show viewers, this has been a great topic tonight. We've been discussing, you might be able to say, our vision for how we represent ourselves. That is, of course, redistricting. And we had on a great guest tonight for that. And I'm glad you were able to watch. And I do hope that you watch our next shows in the future. But as we all know, this is the Beach Brothers Show. And definitely stay tuned for the next one.
This show was brought to you by Positive Vibes Incorporated, our consulting services. We do credit fixes, we do tax resolution, we lend private money, and debt consolidation. So if you need some of these services, we're waiting here for you. Credit fixes, tax resolutions, private money, and debt consolidation. Make sure you call Positive Vibes Incorporated.
Now, before I go, I don't want to leave our great beach brother, Mr. Jose Cruz, out. So definitely want to finish up with his outro.
It's never too early or too late to plan for retirement. Let me show you how to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your assets from loss due to catastrophic decisions that may affect you the rest of your life. Please call me.